The rain lashed against the steel roof of Rodri Motors, relentless, like 1,000 angry fists demanding entry. Clara Sterling emerged from the sleek Aston Martin Valkyrie AMR Pro, a $3 million masterpiece of carbon fiber and hybrid power. Then, with no warning, the engine died. One moment it was purring like a lion, and the next, silent. No sound, no drama. Just gone. 3 senior mechanics crowded around the car, their faces illuminated by flickering diagnostic screens that spat out error codes that made no sense. Clara's heels echoed through the garage, sharp and decisive, like a countdown. 3 of you, she said, her voice as frosty as an Arctic wind, and none of you can tell me why it won't start. A tall man stepped forward from the shadows. He was built like someone who'd spent his life in the trenches, rough, tough, and marked by time. His coveralls were stained with the work of years. The garage owner cleared his throat. This is Ethan Miller. He started this morning. He used to be an aerospace engineer. Clara's gaze drifted over Ethan, from his weathered hands to his calm face. She smirked, a laugh bubbling up that was more cold amusement than warmth. Then fix it. If you manage to fix this engine, I'll marry you. Deal? The other mechanics snickered, someone let out a wolfish whistle. Clara's smile was a razor edge. Ethan paused, his eyes locking onto hers for a full 3 seconds. Then, in that same measured tone, he replied, deal. Her laughter disappeared into the rain, leaving only the silent weight of his words hanging between them. Neither of them knew that moment would set everything into motion. Clara Sterling had learned long ago that building walls was easier than building a company. Her father founded Sterling Logistics when she was just 7 years old. The company began as a small freight shipping operation, with supply chains that stretched over 3 continents. By the time she was 25, Clara had earned an MBA from Wharton and a reputation as an unshakable, untouchable force in the business world. At 27, she married Daniel Rothschild. Daniel came from a lineage steeped in old money, with ties to shipping empires that had the power to manipulate politics and erase scandals. Their wedding was the kind of event that the business world couldn't stop talking about, with the media dubbing it a merger made in heaven. But just 3 years later, she found Daniel in her own office, with his assistant sprawled on the desk she'd inherited from her grandfather. Clara didn't scream. She didn't cry. She picked up the phone and called her lawyer before she called her mother. Their divorce played out like an execution in the public eye. Daniel's family painted her as cold, controlling, unlovable, and the tabloids were more than eager to paint her as the villain. Ice Queen CEO loses her king, blared across the pages of the New York Post, next to a picture of her leaving the courthouse, her face as expressionless as marble. But Clara won it all in the settlement. Everything, except the ability to trust anyone ever again. She threw herself into Sterling Logistics with the same desperation as someone drowning, pushing the company into Southeast Asia, acquiring competitors, and doubling revenues in just 18 months. The board adored her. The employees feared her. She told herself that was enough. Alone at night in her penthouse, with a view of downtown Los Angeles, she would stare out the window, wondering when her heart had stopped being protected by glass and started to feel imprisoned by it. Ethan Miller, in contrast, had journeyed in the opposite direction, away from the skies and into the grease and grime of car engines. He had met Sarah at Lockheed Martin, where she worked in procurement and he engineered hydraulic systems for fighter jets. They were young and hopeful when they married, dreaming of a small house in Burbank, a few kids, maybe a dog. Then came Lila, born 2 months premature, her tiny heart not quite right. The doctors called it right ventricular septal defect, a hole between the chambers of her heart. It was operable, but risky. They needed to wait until Lila was strong enough. But Sarah hemorrhaged during delivery, and there was nothing they could do. Ethan held his daughter in one arm while signing his wife's death certificate with the other. Shaken to the core, Ethan took a leave of absence from Lockheed. That leave turned into another, then another, until he never returned. His supervisor called it a waste of potential. His accountant labeled it financial suicide. Ethan called it being a father. He took a job at a small garage in Glendale, then another in Pasadena. The pay was a fraction of what it used to be, but the hours were flexible. When Lila's health took a turn, when her lips turned blue and her breathing grew shallow, he could drop everything and rush to her side. He stopped dating. He stopped going out. He stopped being anyone other than Lila's father. His former colleagues from Lockheed invited him to reunions. He never went. That life no longer belonged to him, and he no longer believed the future was something you could control. Lila, now 7 years old, had been through 4 hospitalizations. She spent her time drawing pictures of hearts with wings. Every night, she asked if her mom was watching from heaven. He always said yes, even though he didn't believe in anything beyond what he could touch. They lived in a small 1-bedroom apartment in North Hollywood. Lila got the bedroom, Ethan slept on a futon in the living room. The walls were thin enough that he could hear her breathing through the night, soft, steady, the rhythm that kept him tethered to this world, to her. 2 people, both convinced they had exhausted their share of happiness. Neither of them ready for what was to come next. By the time the garage emptied, Ethan was the only one left. The other mechanics had given up, shaking their heads at the Valkyrie like it was a cursed object. Clara had already left in an Uber, her phone glued to her ear as she rearranged the next day's meetings to accommodate the disaster. But Ethan stayed. He didn't stay for her, or for the job. He stayed because the issue gnawed at him. How could a $3 million machine be defeated by something so simple? Something fixable. Something that everyone else had missed. He shed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. The Valkyrie's engine bay was an engineering marvel, carbon fiber, titanium, every part meticulously designed for weight and performance. It was beautiful, intricate, and completely unforgiving of mistakes. He ignored the diagnostic computer. Ignored the flashing error codes. Instead, he traced the electrical system by hand, following each wire and checking every connection with both his fingers and his eyes. 40 minutes in, he found the culprit. The ground wire on the ECU junction box had been connected to the wrong terminal, positive instead of negative. A simple mistake, probably made during the last service. It had created a feedback loop that had scrambled the computer, making it think the engine was failing when in reality, nothing was wrong at all. One wire. One careless moment. He fixed it in 15 minutes with a socket wrench, double-checked every other connection, and then closed the hood. He wiped his hands on a rag and hit the start button. The V12 roared to life. Smooth. Perfect. Furious at being ignored, Ethan let the engine hum for a full 5 minutes, listening to the smooth rhythm of its operation, watching the diagnostics stabilize. Then, he switched it off, gathered his tools, and walked out without saying a word. No note. No demand for gratitude. The task was completed. That was all that mattered. The next morning, when Clara returned, the Valkyrie roared to life at the first turn of the key. She stood frozen, her hand resting on the door handle, eyes fixed on the dashboard as if it had betrayed her by working. "Who fixed it?" she asked, voice cold. The garage owner glanced over at Ethan, who was already elbow-deep in the guts of a Honda Civic on the other side of the shop. Ethan barely nodded, a quick, almost imperceptible gesture. "Not sure," he murmured. The garage owner smoothly lied. One of the night crew must have figured it out. But Clara wasn't fooled. Her gaze stayed on Ethan, watching him work. For 30 seconds, she observed him, the fluidity of his movements, the certainty in his hands. No wasted energy, no second-guessing. This wasn't someone performing for an audience. This was a man who knew exactly what he was doing, without the need for anyone's approval. A shift occurred in Clara's chest, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't attraction, not yet, at least. It was something deeper. Recognition. The recognition of someone who operated by the same code, competence above all else. Results over accolades. The work mattered more than the recognition. She left without offering a thank you, but his presence lingered in her thoughts all morning. 3 days later, Clara concocted a reason to return. She invented a noise in the steering column. A vibration in the brakes. An excuse so thin, it almost embarrassed her to say it out loud. Pulling into Rodri Motors around 2 p.m., the Valkyrie hummed like it had never been sick. She found Ethan in the back corner of the shop, seated on an overturned bucket. In his lap, a small girl slept soundly, her head resting against his chest. Clara stopped in her tracks. The girl's tiny hand was curled into Ethan's shirt. When the little girl stirred and opened her eyes, Clara held her breath. The girl gazed at Clara for a long moment before a slow, knowing smile stretched across her face. "I dreamed about you. You were a sad princess." The words landed like a heavy blow. Clara had once had a brother, someone she lost when she was 12. A heart defect no one noticed in time. For years, she'd perfected the art of not thinking about him. Ethan's hand moved gently across his daughter's back as he spoke quietly. "This is Lila. She's got a big imagination," Lila added seriously. "And a big heart. That's what the doctors say." "It doesn't work right," Ethan explained, his voice calm and rehearsed, as though he had said it 1,000 times. "But we're managing. Waiting for her to be strong enough for surgery." Clara's throat tightened. Lila sat up then, suddenly full of energy. "But I'm okay. I can run for almost a whole minute now. Last year, I could only do 30 seconds. Clara found herself kneeling in front of the girl without realizing it, eye level with this tiny person who measured her life in heartbeats. "That's really impressive," she said, her voice thick with something she hadn't expected to feel. "Dad says I'm the strongest person he knows." Lila grinned, and Clara saw something of Ethan in her, a quiet strength, a determination to not be defined by circumstance. Ethan checked Lila's pulse against his watch. It was a habit, Clara realized. Not a crisis. He counted for 30 seconds, his fingers gentle on her wrist. When he was satisfied, he let go, and Lila hopped down, already chattering about a motorcycle that had been brought in that morning. Clara rose slowly, her movements deliberate. 5 minutes with Lila had cracked open a place inside her that had been sealed for years. "Your car's fine," Ethan said, his focus still on Lila. "I thought you needed a reason to come back." Clara couldn't stop herself from asking. Ethan's eyes met hers, and for the first time, they weren't cold or guarded. They were just, knowing. "You don't." Clara stood there, caught off guard, without a clever retort. For once, she had no prepared response. From that moment, their routine began, though neither of them ever called it that. Clara started stopping by the garage during her lunch break, coffee in hand, the kind that cost $8 a cup, along with pastries from the French bakery downtown. She told herself it was all about networking, staying grounded, keeping ties with real people rather than just boardrooms and spreadsheets. But deep down, she knew she was lying to herself. Ethan would take a break from whatever car he was working on, and they'd sit together on the bench outside the garage. The traffic of Ventura Boulevard flowed by in a blur. Lila would color in her sketchbook between them, humming songs Clara didn't recognize. At first, they talked about engines, mechanics, and technical details, safe territory for Clara. She knew more about machinery than most people realized. Her father had made sure she understood every aspect of his business, from the trucks that hauled cargo to the ships that carried it across the globe. But slowly, the conversations became less about engines and more about life. And Clara started to feel something shift, something she couldn't quite name. As the days passed, the conversations between Clara and Ethan shifted in tone. They drifted away from work and moved toward more human subjects, movies they'd seen, books they'd read, the small failures that came with simply existing in a city that demanded perfection. One afternoon, Clara hesitated before asking, "Does it scare you, raising her alone?" Ethan fell silent for a while, the question hanging between them like an unspoken weight. Lila had curled up against Clara's side, asleep, a development that had surprised both of them. Finally, Ethan spoke. Every single day. His voice was quiet, almost resigned. But being scared and doing it anyway, that's not courage. That's just being a parent. Clara considered his words, feeling something shift in her chest. That sounds like courage to me. Ethan smiled, but there was something sad around the edges. You can't be brave if you're not terrified first, he murmured. That's what Sarah used to say. It was the first time he'd mentioned his late wife. Clara didn't press him for more. She just sat there, the warmth of Lila's small, rhythmic breathing against her ribs, and listened. She made me promise, he said after a moment. Before she died. She made me swear I'd give Lila a good life. His eyes flicked to his daughter, who was still curled up beside Clara. Not a perfect one. She knew that was impossible. But a good one, full of love, safety, and people who gave a damn. Clara's throat tightened, and she found herself speaking before she could stop. You're doing that. Ethan looked at his daughter again, his face shifting into something complicated. Some days, I'm not sure. Clara felt a pang of familiarity. Some days, I think I'm just keeping her alive until I figure out what I'm actually supposed to do, she said. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Small things cause big failures. You taught me that. He furrowed his brow, confusion crossing his face. I never said that. You did, Clara replied softly. About the Valkyrie. The ground wire. Understanding dawned in that moment, and she spoke slowly, as if putting together the pieces of a puzzle. One wrong connection, and the whole system crashes. In engines, she trailed off. Ethan's eyes locked with hers, steady and calm. Yeah. In hearts, too. The words lingered in the air like a quiet truth neither of them wanted to say aloud, but both understood all too well. Later that week, Lila started calling Clara Ms. Clara with the shiny shoes. It should have sounded silly, a child's innocent attempt to label someone. Instead, it felt like a name that mattered, like being seen by someone whose vision was unclouded by the noise and falsehoods of adult life. The three of them, Clara, Ethan, and Lila, fell into a shape that wasn't quite friendship, wasn't quite family, but was something real enough to shake Clara in ways nothing in her corporate life ever had. She was terrified of losing it. She had no idea how right she was to be afraid. Enter Marcus Chen, a photographer with a keen eye for scandal and a gossip blog called Elite Exposed. A mid-level manager at Sterling Logistics had tipped him off about Clara's increasing presence at Rodri Motors, likely with a grudge and a flair for drama. On a Tuesday afternoon, Marcus captured the moment. The photo was simple enough, Clara, Ethan, and Lila sitting together on a bench outside Rodri Motors, laughing at something Lila had said. The little girl was nestled between them, holding both their hands. Clara's head was thrown back in genuine laughter, her face open in a way it never was in boardrooms. Ethan, looking at Clara, wore an expression that was unmistakable. The photo went live at 6 p.m. By 8 p.m., it was everywhere. Ice Queen CEO melts for blue collar, was the headline on Elite Exposed. By the time TMZ picked it up, then page 6, the story was everywhere. The internet exploded with reactions. Half the comments praised Clara, calling it a moment of humanity for the CEO who'd been portrayed as cold, distant, robotic. The other half scoffed, accusing her of orchestrating a publicity stunt, a calculated move to soften her image before the quarterly earnings report. Clara's phone started ringing at 8:30 p.m. and didn't stop. Her publicist, her lawyer, 3 different board members, and even her mother, who led with, "What are you thinking?" The rest of the conversation only got worse from there. At 10 p.m., the board called an emergency meeting. Clara sat at the head of the table in the Sterling Logistics conference room, the floor-to-ceiling windows looking down on the city. The table was long enough to seat 30 people. She was facing 7 individuals, people who controlled her company's fate. Richard Moss, the chairman, wasted no time. This is a problem. Clara's voice was steady, betraying none of the storm raging inside. It's a photo. It's a narrative, Moss replied, pulling up his tablet and reading the headlines. Here's Forbes, Sterling CEO's shocking romance. Bloomberg, has Clara Sterling lost her edge? The Wall Street Journal is running an op-ed tomorrow questioning your judgment. My judgment is fine, Clara shot back, her jaw tightening. Patricia Winters, the CFO, chimed in. Then explain to me, Clara, why you're spending your lunch breaks at a garage in North Hollywood instead of here, managing the company during a critical expansion. Clara's patience thinned, but she remained composed. I'm allowed to have a personal life. Moss sneered. Not one that makes stockholders nervous. We've got institutional investors calling in. 3 pension funds want reassurance that you're still focused. The Singapore deal is already shaky. The words began to blur together, optics, liability, the pressure mounting with every syllable. It was like a wall of sound, designed to smother her. Finally, Moss leaned forward, his tone almost gentle. You need to make a statement tonight. Clarify that this is not a relationship. That your focus remains entirely on Sterling Logistics. Clara looked around the table at the faces of people she had known for years, worked with, trusted, built something with. None of them were looking at her as a person. They saw her only as an asset to be managed. And if I don't, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Then we'll be forced to consider whether you're still the right person to lead this company. Moss's voice was almost too soft. We're not trying to control your life, Clara, he continued. We're trying to protect the business your father built. Surely, you understand that. Clara understood. She understood that power was always conditional. That the walls she built around herself weren't just protection, they were a prison she had been assigned to guard. At midnight, she stood in front of cameras at a press conference. Her hair was flawless, her suit immaculate. Her voice was steady, betraying nothing. I want to address the photos circulating today, she said, her voice carrying through the room. Rodri Motors services several of my vehicles. I've developed a professional relationship with the staff there. Any suggestion of a personal relationship is inaccurate. My focus remains entirely on Sterling Logistics and our continued growth. The words felt hollow, like ashes in her mouth. They were the same lies she had told herself about what mattered for years. Somewhere across the city, Ethan was watching her on TV. She didn't need to check to know. He would hear those words. Any suggestion of a personal relationship is inaccurate. And Clara knew exactly what she had chosen. The cameras flashed. Clara's smile faltered, something in her chest tightening as that fragile part of her, something that had just begun to heal, shut itself off again. Ethan, on the other hand, didn't finish watching the press conference. He lasted all of 30 seconds, heard Clara's voice turn flat and corporate when she said professional relationship, and switched off the TV. The apartment was dark, the only sound the soft rhythm of Lila's breathing as she slept. Ethan sat still, the weight of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years pressing down on him. It wasn't anger, that would have been easier. It was disappointment. The kind that came from hoping when you knew better, from letting your guard down with someone who reminded you why you'd built your walls in the first place. He'd known this was coming. Part of him had always known. Clara Sterling lived in a world that was nothing like his. Her world was penthouses, board meetings, and decisions made by committees. His world was an apartment with air conditioning that barely worked, where every dollar was budgeted 3 months in advance. The fairy tale of 2 worlds colliding and finding happiness, well, that was for movies. Real life was messier, harder, and governed by rules neither of them had set but both had to obey. At 2 a.m., Ethan opened his laptop and typed out his resignation letter, keeping it brief. He didn't want to drag it out. Thank you for the opportunity. My last day will be Friday. He sent it without hesitation, before he could change his mind. Thursday morning, he went to Rodri Motors and acted like nothing had changed. He fixed a transmission, rotated the tires on a Lexus, and helped the new guy figure out why over-tightening oil filters was a mistake. His hands worked with muscle memory, but his mind was elsewhere. Friday afternoon, Ethan cleaned out his corner of the garage. He didn't have much, some tools he'd brought from home, a thermos, and a drawing Lila had made of the two of them standing next to a race car. He packed everything into a cardboard box. The garage owner found him around 4 p.m. "You sure about this?" she asked. "Yeah," he replied, his voice steady but hollow. "She hasn't been back since Tuesday," the owner noted. Ethan nodded. "Hadn't expected her to." "Not about her," he added quickly, "just time to move on." It was a lie, but a kind one. The owner clapped him on the shoulder and didn't push. Ethan drove home in his 13-year-old Toyota Tacoma. Lila was singing along to the radio in the back seat, blissfully unaware. She asked if they could get ice cream. He said yes, even though it wasn't in the budget. Some days, you needed ice cream more than you needed financial responsibility. That night, after tucking Lila into bed, she asked quietly, "Is Miss Clara coming back?" Ethan's heart cracked a little. "I don't think so, sweetheart. Did we do something wrong?" "No," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes people just have different lives." Lila thought about it seriously, her small face furrowed in concern. "That's sad." "Yeah," Ethan replied, his voice quiet. "It is." She fell asleep holding his hand, and he stayed there until her grip loosened. Then he moved to the living room and stared at the ceiling, unable to shut off the thoughts swirling in his head. He didn't blame Clara, didn't hate her, he just wished, for about 5 minutes, that he had been someone different. Someone who could fit into her world without her having to blow up her life in the process. But soon, he got over it. Because that's what you do, you get over things, you keep going, because someone depends on you and your feelings are a luxury you can't afford. By Monday, he had a new job lined up at a shop in Burbank, closer to home. The pay wasn't great, but he didn't care. Life continued the way it always did. One day, then another, then another. He stopped checking his phone for messages that weren't coming. Clara, meanwhile, threw herself into her work. She immersed herself in the Singapore expansion, the intensity of her focus almost frantic, like she was trying to outrun her own thoughts. She worked 16-hour days, sleeping more in her office than in her apartment. The business thrived, stock prices climbed, and the board was pleased. Clara felt nothing. She'd buried the feeling long ago. Nothing was safe. Nothing was predictable. Nothing was immune from pain. 3 weeks passed in this haze of corporate success and emotional numbness. Then, at 1:47 a.m. on a Wednesday night, her phone rang. She was still at the office, reviewing contracts, and almost didn't answer. The number was unknown, probably spam. But something made her pick up. "Ms. Sterling?" A woman's voice on the other end, professional, carefully neutral. "This is Allison from Children's Hospital Los Angeles. I'm calling about Lila Miller." Clara's heart stopped for a moment. "What happened?" "She was admitted to the ICU about an hour ago. Her father listed you as an emergency contact. Can you come?" Clara didn't waste a second. She grabbed her keys, her phone, and didn't bother with a coat. She made it to the hospital in 12 minutes. She parked illegally and didn't care, running through the lobby, her mind racing as she punched the button for the cardiac ICU floor 7 times, as though that would make the elevator move faster. The doors opened on the 4th floor to sterile white hallways, the sharp smell of antiseptic and the cold, quiet air of fear. She found Ethan sitting outside the ICU, slumped in a plastic chair. His hair was a mess, his eyes hollowed out, and in his hands, he held what looked like a technical drawing, mechanical, precise, covered in numbers. He looked up when she approached. For a brief second, she saw relief break across his face before it quickly disappeared behind a mask. "What happened?" Clara asked, sitting down next to him without waiting for permission. "Saturday," Ethan's voice cracked, raw. "She collapsed at school. They called 911. His hands trembled as he continued, his voice quieter. "Her heart's failing, Clara. They're saying she needs surgery now. Not in 6 months. Not when she's stronger. Now." Clara sat beside him, her heart heavy, and all the carefully built walls she had spent years constructing began to crumble under the weight of his words. Clara's brain shifted into the mode it knew best: problem-solving, action, results. What do they need? A miracle. Ethan let out a hollow laugh. Or $200,000 I don't have. The surgery's not fully covered by insurance, he continued, his voice cracking. They'll do it anyway. But I'll be paying it off for the rest of my life. And that's if everything goes perfectly, he added bitterly. Clara pulled out her phone without hesitation, her fingers moving quickly. What are you doing? Ethan asked, alarmed. Calling the best pediatric cardiac surgeon in California. Ethan's eyes widened in disbelief. Clara, don't. She didn't look at him. Her voice was steel. Don't tell me not to help. Don't tell me it's too much. I have money sitting in accounts, doing nothing but making more money. She met his gaze, her eyes hard with resolve. Let me use it for something that actually matters. For a moment, Ethan's eyes filled with unshed tears. He was on the verge of breaking, and so was she. I'm sorry, he whispered. For leaving. For not calling. Clara's hand found his. I know what you thought, she said softly, squeezing his hand. You thought I chose them over you. And I did. Because I was scared. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but Clara stopped him. But I'm not that woman anymore. I don't want to be her. Ethan's grip tightened around her hand. What do you want? He asked, his voice trembling. Clara's voice softened, yet her words were firm. This. She gestured to the sterile hallway, the waiting room that reeked of fear and uncertainty, the life-or-death battle they were about to face together. I want this. The messy, terrifying, real thing. Whatever that looks like. Before he could respond, a doctor appeared at the door. Mr. Miller, the doctor said, his voice steady. We're ready to take Lila into surgery. Ethan nodded without saying a word. He stood and followed the doctor down the hallway to a window that looked into the ICU. Clara, her feet moving before she could think, followed them both. Through the glass, she saw Lila. The little girl was so small in her hospital gown, surrounded by machines. But even in that terrifying place, Lila was awake. When she spotted her father, she waved, small, brave, the kind of wave that broke Clara's heart in two. Ethan pressed his hand to the glass, and Lila, in turn, placed her small hand on the other side. Clara stood behind him, placing her hand over his. The three hands, so different, yet united, pressed together against the glass. And in that moment, amidst the beeping machines and the fluorescent lights humming overhead, everything that mattered in the world was contained in that simple, perfect touch. The surgery took 6 hours. Clara made phone calls, arranged for Dr. Raymond Chen, undoubtedly the best pediatric cardiac surgeon in the state, to consult, and made sure that all the paperwork was taken care of. She used her connections, called in favors from hospital board members she had helped with logistics contracts. Ethan, however, remained focused on the drawing Lila had made. Clara finally saw it for what it was, designed for a mechanical heart valve. It was something he'd sketched as a backup plan, a way he thought he could fix Lila's heart himself, if only he could. Neither of them left. Neither of them ate. They just existed in that waiting room, with time moving at a strange pace, stretched and compressed as it does when you're living in a place filled with terror. At 7:42 a.m., Dr. Chen walked through the double doors, removing his surgical cap. For a moment, his face was unreadable, but then he smiled, and the weight of the world seemed to lift from their shoulders. "The surgery was successful," he said, his voice calm but warm. "We repaired the defect and reinforced the surrounding tissue. Barring complications, Lila should make a full recovery." Ethan made a sound that Clara had never heard before, relief, grief, and joy all compressed into one exhale. He bent forward, hands on his knees, and his shoulders shook with the weight of his emotions. Clara's own tears came quickly and fiercely, rushing down her face like a dam breaking. She put her hand on Ethan's back, feeling him tremble, and allowed herself to shake with him. Dr. Chen, ever professional, said, "You can see her in about an hour. She'll be groggy, but she'll know you're there." After the doctor left, Clara and Ethan sat back down, their bodies still heavy with the emotional weight of the night. Ethan turned to Clara, his face streaked with tears he no longer tried to hide. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice raw. Clara shook her head. "You don't have to." "I do," he insisted, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved her life." Clara smiled through her tears. "You saved mine first." She wiped the wetness from her face, and as she did, she whispered, "You just did it so quietly, I almost missed it." Ethan let out a laugh, but it was broken. Then he started crying again. So did she. They sat there together, two people who had forgotten how to cry, crying like they had never allowed themselves to. It was the most honest either of them had been in years. Finally, Clara took a deep breath. "I don't want to go back to that life," she said softly, her voice filled with resolve. "The board meetings, the appearances, pretending I'm not a person." Ethan looked at her, his eyes raw with emotion. "What do you want?" Clara gazed at him, this man who had fixed her car and, in a sense, her heart, with the same patient hands. "I want to fix things. Real things. With you." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond Clara, then he smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him in weeks. "Then let's fix what's broken," he said, his voice steady. "Together." Through the window, the sun began to rise over Los Angeles, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, a burst of color that seemed to promise the impossible. Clara watched the sunrise, feeling something deep in her chest, the carefully sealed-off place in her heart, finally start to open, tenderly, cautiously. At 8:30 a.m., they went in to see Lila. Lila was pale but awake, tubes running from her arms, monitors tracking her heartbeat. When she saw them, she smiled, her face small and fragile. "Did they fix me?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Ethan took her hand, his own voice soft but full of certainty. "Yeah, sweetheart. You're going to be okay." Lila turned her head and looked at Clara. "Are you going to stay?" Clara felt Ethan's eyes on her, the weight of the question pressing down on her. She knew the choice she made would reshape everything. "Yeah," she said firmly. "I'm staying." Lila's smile grew wider. "Then I'm going to sleep now," she said, her eyelids fluttering shut, and her heartbeat steady on the monitor beside her. Clara and Ethan stood side by side, their eyes fixed on the girl they both loved. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that this was the beginning of something neither of them knew how to name, but something they all desperately needed. 6 months later, the headlines were different. Former Sterling CEO launches nonprofit garage for second chances. Clara had resigned from Sterling Logistics in March. The board had tried everything to keep her, offers of raises, concessions, promises of flexibility. She thanked them and left anyway. With Ethan, she founded Phoenix Garage in a warehouse space in East LA. The name had come from Lila, who'd drawn a picture of a bird rising from car parts and said, "Like you and Dad." The concept was simple but powerful: teach automotive skills to people who needed a second chance. Ex-convicts, single mothers, kids who dropped out of high school, anyone willing to work hard and learn something real. Clara handled the business side, fundraising, partnerships, grants. She was good at it, better than she'd ever been at running Sterling, because now she actually believed in what she was building. Ethan taught. He was patient, thorough, the kind of instructor who never made anyone feel stupid for not knowing something. His students, many of whom had been failed by every system they'd encountered, began to succeed under his guidance. Lila, fully recovered from the surgery, became the garage's unofficial mascot. She could run for 5 minutes now without getting winded, and she would greet students at the door, showing off her scar and telling anyone who would listen about hearts that didn't work right, but kept beating anyway. The walls of the garage were painted industrial gray. The floors were stained with oil that wouldn't come out. Above the main workstation, someone had welded a metal sign. Fix engines, fix lives. They weren't making millions. They weren't getting written up in Forbes. But they were making a difference, one person at a time. And Clara discovered that it mattered more than anything she'd ever done behind a desk. She learned to get her hands dirty, literally, replacing brake pads, changing oil, diagnosing engine problems by sound. She was terrible at it, clumsy and slow, constantly asking Ethan for help. But she kept trying. One evening, after the students had gone home, Clara stood in the garage, staring at the hydraulic lift, the tool chests, the cars in various stages of repair. Her clothes were covered in grease, her manicure destroyed, her hair a ponytail that had long given up. But she felt more herself than she had in 10 years. Ethan found her there, standing among the chaos and the tools. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," she smiled, her voice soft. "I'm good." Ethan moved closer, and Clara leaned into him, his arms solid around her shoulders. They stood there in the quiet, watching the dust motes drift in the light, listening to the distant hum of traffic on Sunset Boulevard. "Thank you," Clara said eventually. "For letting me be part of this." "You are this," he replied quietly. "I couldn't do it without you." "We balance each other," she said, her words simple but true. "Yeah," Ethan agreed. "We do." It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. It wasn't a grand declaration or a dramatic moment. It was two people acknowledging the thing they'd built together, something stronger than passion, more reliable than romance. It was love that showed up in coveralls and kept its promises. The 1-year anniversary of Phoenix Garage fell on a Saturday. They threw a party, students, past and present, donors, local business owners who had supported them. Someone brought a cake. Someone else brought a keg. Lila wore a dress covered in sequins and told everyone who would listen about the time she almost died but didn't. Clara stood at the front of the garage, holding something small and metallic. She'd been dreading this moment all week, but now that it was here, she felt calm. "A year ago," she began, and the crowd grew quiet. "I stood in a different garage and said something cruel. I said, 'Fix this engine, and I'll marry you.' A few people laughed, most just listened." Clara held up the object, a spark plug from the Aston Martin Valkyrie, the one Ethan had replaced that night. "This is from that engine. The one I thought no one could fix." She looked at Ethan, who was standing off to the side, Lila perched on his shoulders. "He didn't just fix my car," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "He fixed me. Reminded me what it means to build something with your hands, to show up for people, to love without conditions or contracts." She walked over to Ethan, and Lila giggled, sensing something big was about to happen. Clara reached into her pocket, pulling out a simple silver ring, shaped like a gear. It was nothing like the massive diamond she had worn during her first marriage. "You fixed mine too," Ethan said quietly, and Clara realized he'd planned this as well, because he had his own ring. A matching gear, slightly larger. They exchanged rings there, in front of everyone. No officiant, no ceremony. Just two people who had learned the hard way that the best things in life weren't clean, simple, or easy, but they were worth showing up for every single day. Lila cheered, the crowd erupted, music played, and the party shifted into something bigger, louder, more celebratory. Later, when most people had left, Clara, Ethan, and Lila stood in the empty garage. Above them, someone had hung a banner that read, "Fixed with love." Clara, Ethan, and Lila. Lila stood between them, holding both their hands. "Are we a family now?" "We've been a family for a while," Ethan said, smiling. "We're just making it official." "Good," Lila said, satisfied. Then, with the abrupt pivot only a 7-year-old could pull off, she asked, "Can we get a dog?" Clara and Ethan looked at each other, both laughing despite everything they'd been through. After the heartbreak, the surgery, the rebuilding, this was the question that made them both laugh. "Maybe," Clara said. "Definitely," Ethan countered. They locked up the garage together, turned off the lights, and walked out into the warm Los Angeles night. The neon sign above the door, a phoenix rising from a pile of gears, cast red and orange light across the sidewalk behind them. The engines were waiting to be fixed. Lives were waiting to be rebuilt. Tomorrow would bring new problems, new challenges, new people who needed second chances. But tonight, they were just 3 people who had found each other in the wreckage and decided that broken things could be beautiful if you were willing to do the work. They drove home in Ethan's truck, Lila asleep between them, Clara's hand resting on Ethan's knee. And everything that mattered fit perfectly in that moment. Imperfect, hard-won, and absolutely real.